Thanks everyone for joining here today. We're excited to be able to have this press conference on behalf of Organization for Competitive Markets. We have board members with us here today from OCM. We have like-minded organizations as well that have joined us that would like to give their support to this piece of legislation. And I would like to introduce Marty Irby. Marty is a board director with the Organization for Competitive Markets, and he has been working tirelessly on this piece of legislation for some time. I believe even he had actually named the legislation when it was first introduced. So Marty, I'll let you do kind of the background of the legislation, and then we'll open it up for some thoughts.
Yes, thank you so much, Mike. Thank everyone for being here. Marty Irby. I'm a board director at OCM and also the executive director of Animal Wellness Action here in DC, and have been working with Mike and Fred and others on this issue for the past 6 years. They have the vast history and knowledge on the issue, but I can give you sort of a lay of the land on Capitol Hill. This is the third Congress that the bill has been introduced in the House and the Senate in its current form, the Opportunities for Fairness in Farming Act. And Senator Lee and Senator Booker, of course, initiated the legislation back in the first Congress when it was introduced. We had a Farm Bill amendment that mirrored the legislation that was also co-sponsored by Senator Paul, Senator Warren, and Senator Hassan. And that was one of 3 Farm Bill amendments that the leadership allowed to come to the floor for a vote in the Senate back in 2018. Support from folks that we were a little surprised about. We saw Chuck Grass for it, many of the Midwestern senators, but in the end, we were not able to get it in the final Farm Bill that year. So the legislation has been introduced again in the last Congress and then now in this Congress. On the House side, it was introduced an identical bill back in the latter part of June by Congresswoman Dina Titus from Nevada and Congresswoman Nancy Mace from Charleston, South Carolina. We are really hoping that we can get some action on the House side under the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Representative Mace is the ranking committee on the House side. And then we're hopeful that Senator Lee and Senator Booker and Paul and Warren and Gillibrand will push hard on their committees to address this issue, especially in agriculture, because it's so important to so many farmers. And we have about 250,000 farmers across America that support this legislation, as well as many other groups like the National Taxpayers Union and even the Heritage Foundation. So it is an unlikely group of allies, but we appreciate everyone being involved and hope to advance this legislation moving forward. One of the things that I wanted to mention about Fred and Vaughn can get into the nuts and bolts of things, but the legislation basically creates a system of checks and balances and accountability for auditing in all of the USDA checkoff programs that we've seen so many investigations about that have proven time and time again that funds are being illegally utilized to lobby, and there is a ton of corruption that has been found in many of these checkoffs. I don't know if we have any pork producers here today, but the legislation also addresses the issue of disparagement and prohibits the checkoffs from disparaging one product over another. Using that as an example, you might be familiar with the slogan, pork the other white meat. In that instance, that's where you have the checkoffs picking winners and losers, because there are other products. You might remember seeing any of the pork chops that you've ever eaten that were gray and not necessarily white in the way that they appeared. Those come from Berkshire hogs or heritage hogs that are raised all across America. Those farmers have felt definitely the brunt end of the pork the other white meat slogan, because it makes people want to buy that type of meat instead of the product that they are producing with their heritage hogs. So that's just one example. There are many others I know in the beef and dairy world, and I'll turn it back to you, Mike, to press forward.
All right, I appreciate that. Thanks, Marty.
Yep.
And yeah, as a former dairy farmer, I can speak to the issues of dairy. Most people do not realize that dairy farmers not only pay a checkoff, their own checkoff, which is totaling of almost half of the entire checkoff program. It's $450 million is what dairy pays in. And The beef, of course, is another checkoff that dairy farmers pay, because every veal calf that every dairy farmer sells, they're paying $1 per head. So on a per weight basis, they're paying a fair amount above and beyond those who sell feeder steers. So it is, it's just the way the program's set up, but it makes it that much more important, though, for dairy farmers to be concerned as to this program and to the direction in which it seems to have been headed. And I'll just give you a little bit of an example of that. Back in 2017, OCM broke a story through Politico that there have been 4 to 5 years worth of reports that have not been reported to the USDA had not reported to Congress. And dairy is one that must report on an annual basis. The other checkoffs are not held to that level of accountability, but here you have USDA not even following through with their obligation. And that's a major concern. So, we want to see other checkoffs held to the level of dairy and then to be enforced, because really what has been happening is we have our representation not really being able to even answer to what it is that we've been questioning. If I go to my congressman who is supposed to have access to that information and he does not have access to it simply because USDA did not follow through with their obligation of annual reporting, then he can't represent me. He is in a position where he no longer can do his job, and we need to give the opportunity for our representatives to do their job. The other one thing that I just wanted to quickly mention is the fact that many times if farmers have a problem with the entire checkoff program or a portion of it, they go to government. And while the government officials will say, well, it's not a government program, it's a farmer-funded program. So then the farmer goes to the farmer-funded program leaders and they ask the same questions and they say, well, it's a government program. So it's a circular argument. You can't get the answers that you request simply because it seems like it's almost designed in such a way that you're not to get the answers. And if you go to court to get them, you run into the same issue. You run into the circular argument. So this piece of legislation would make it that much more difficult for that circular argument to exist. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'd like to now turn it over to Vaughn. Vaughn is our president of OCM. He's our fearless leader. And turn it over to you, Vaughn.
Thank you, Mike. As president of OCM and checkoff committee chairman for RCAF USA, we thank Senators Lee, along with sponsoring Senators Booker, Paul, Warren, and Gillibrand for introducing these two bills. These two bills are crucial for restoring accountability and transparency to all U.S. commodity checkoff programs. For too long, the OFT Act will provide the necessary enforcements to prevent producers' hard-earned checkoff dollars from being used against them. For example, in the beef checkoff, our largest contractor receives over 82% of their gross revenues from the mandatory checkoff funds. These hijacked producer checkoff funds often support policies contrary to producer livelihoods. Producer-funded checkoff programs have evolved into mandatory government speech with little or no producer guidance or representation. Currently in our beef checkoff, many young producers have never had a say, as there has never been a referendum vote in its 35-year history. This off-act legislation will instill much needed accountability and transparency to prevent the current misuse of checkoff funds. We thank these senators for introducing these two bills aimed at creating long overdue industry safeguards. OCM supports and stands ready to assist with the fruition of this checkoff reform legislation for the benefit of independent agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaughn. Next, I would like to turn it over to National Dairy Producers Organization, Joe Arens. Joe is a board member. He is from Michigan, and he and his sons have a dairy farm. So, Joe?
Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you for this opportunity to present the feelings of the National Dairy Producers Organization members, as well as all dairy farmers across the country. After 38 years without transparency, many of us feel the checkoff programs have strayed way off course, and they defy the original intent. The recently introduced OFF Act, Opportunity for Fairness in Farming Act, is a glimmer of light in a very misguided organization.
Followed by pound.
Dairy has a huge investment in this checkoff program, even larger than the beef organization. Since its inception in 1983, farmers have been mandated to contribute more than $9 billion to the checkoff organization. This currently comes out to about $400 million a year, or $16,000 per year for a dairy farmer with a farm with 400 cows, our size. Thousands and thousands of producers have been forced out of the business in recent years. These farmers all paid into the checkoff fund, and they are receiving nothing in return. We owe them an explanation and an investigation of what has been going on with checkup monies. At NDPO, our primary mission is to help producers retake control of their cooperatives and manage the milk supplies until we achieve a profitable price. We feel the checkoff over the past 38 years has ventured way off course from its original intent, which was to promote, to educate, and do research, all for farmer benefit. They pay the bill. This lack of oversight, lack of accountability, and the free-flowing $400 million in annual revenues, this very complex maze of sub-organizations within the dairy checkoff, all with different missions, all with different boards, different senior staffs, and separate offices across the country, looks more like a massive money laundering operation. Checkoff headquarters, DMI, in Rosemont, Illinois, led by Tom Gallagher. The salary has been, over the past 16 years, from $800,000 to $1 million annually. He governs the 53 state checkoff organizations. All of this bureaucracy, many have their own boards, their own executives, and their own employees. In addition to these 53 state organizations, there are more organizations within the checkoff. National Dairy Council, the American Dairy Association, USDEC, that's the Dairy Export Council. That's the particular segment of the checkoff where Tom Vilsack, after terminating his job as Secretary of Agriculture, walked into and took over the leadership for a salary of close to $1 million a year. We have other organizations, Gen Youth, Fuel Up to Play 60, and we even have agreements with some anti-agriculture groups, the World Wildlife Fund and the Humane Society. Private corporation CEOs are held accountable because they have to generate revenue and manage expenses to come up with profits. Nonprofit CEOs and leadership people do not have to worry about revenues. The revenues flow automatically. $400 million a year appears at their doorstep annually. Their only function is to disperse those monies. The governance of all these various entities within these organizations is questionable. Many cooperatives, as dairy farmers know, thoroughly vet their board member candidates to make sure that they are status quo and that they go along with the leadership. Now, these cooperative board members, simultaneously, many serve on various checkoff boards as well. This includes DFA, the largest dairy cooperative in the country, has members from their boards positioned in most major dairy leadership positions. And this type of a co-op makes money from cheap milk. So many of these interests are towards cheap milk and not necessarily for the benefit of the dairy farmers that they are supposed to represent. National Milk Producers is a major arm of the USDA on dairy policy, is also involved and has board members that simultaneously sit on various checkoff organizations. And we have many food processing CEOs that sit on these checkoff boards. So as you can see, this seems to be kind of an elite ruling class of people that are running checkoff. Lastly, I want to talk about referendum. I personally and many farmers consider the checkoff referendum a farce. The beef organization has just attempted to gather 80,000 signatures, and this is quite a task to accomplish. Does anyone think that the dairy organization with its checkoff, with $400 million that the checkoff employees have to work with, does anyone really think that a referendum will stop the checkoff when they have offices in 53 locations? Some states have 2. It's really questionable whether this is a democratically run organization. The time is right. This is the moment for oversight, for investigation, explanation, and accountability from the checkoff organizations. I would like to thank, on behalf of our members and dairy farmers, the efforts of OCM to bring this legislation to a forefront. And we thank all of the legislators who have co-sponsors and are supporting this legislation to bring transparency to the checkoff organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Very well said. And this is just one example with National Dairy Producers Organization showing support. This is why we wanted to have this conference call and invite the press to this, because there's strength in numbers. And along with that, I'd like to introduce next Michael Kovach, who is with the Pennsylvania Farmers Union, as one more example of an organizational support with support of transparency within legislation. So Michael.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm Michael Kovach. I'm the Vice President and Policy Director for the Pennsylvania Farmers Union. I can say very definitely that through the course of our policy review to see how this aligns with our policy, that it aligns very well. Transparency in any endeavor, business or government run, is absolutely critical to fairness in that process. I'm sure that a lot of us could tell a lot of stories about how many dollars went out the door and funded things that had either no effect or deleterious effect on our businesses. Because again, I've never seen grass-fed beef. It's what for dinner on any stickers. So as a sort of a specialty value-added producer, I still have to pay into that system and have no ability to know whether I've ever been benefited by it, other than what I hear on the TV. So transparency in every aspect, but especially when you're exacting what effectively is a tax. I mean, we fought the British over taxation without representation a couple of 100 years ago, and to even be having to have this conversation seems a little bit ridiculous to me. But thankfully, this legislation's taken a step toward correcting the wrongs that's been done, and who knows how many wrongs, and giving us a look at exactly how those dollars are spent. And I have a feeling that a lot of things will come to light when that does come to pass. So thanks very much for this legislation and for this opportunity to speak for the family farmers of Pennsylvania. We are very definitely in support of transparency in the beef checkoff and elsewhere, everywhere.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, and in the spirit of other organizations in support of this as well, and to speak to the level of transparency, I would like to introduce NFO, Dick Bylsma. Happy to have Dick with us today.
Thank you, Michael. I
Absolutely.
absolutely appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. My name is Dick Bylsma. As Michael said, I am the Director of Dairy Sales for the National Farmers Organization. The National Farmers Organization is an agricultural cooperative that markets not only our farmers' milk, but also we market cattle and grain. So these are very important issues to us. It is the stance of NFO that during these very difficult times, we need to leave as much money on our farms as possible. They need all the cash and money they can just to stay alive. And if we do force money off the farm, if we do take money off the farm, we are morally responsible to make sure that money is wisely and efficiently spent. So we want to throw our support behind this legislation. We want to thank the senators who have sponsored it. I want to thank Mike Irby personally for his efforts through OCM and other organizations to push this through. The NFO believes that we need to stop the consolidation in all of agriculture and every commodity. We need to stop the consolidation of our industry. We need to keep our food supplies safe and diversified. We need to keep them spread out. That's going to require that we keep our smaller farmers healthy and economically viable. So again, Michael, I just want to tell you we support your efforts here. We support this legislation, and I thank you for your hard work.
Absolutely. If there's any members of the press that would like to reach out to any one of these gentlemen, reach out to me. I can forward to you their contact information. I don't think their emails were attached to the press release that was sent out. So I'd be happy to forward that information on, and then any one of these gentlemen from any one of these organizations can reach out to you specifically if you would like a quote. Now let's move back to OCM and bring it back to our Vice President, Taylor Haynes. Do we have Taylor with us? I know he was with us. I saw him on the screen. I think you're on mute, Taylor. I think you're still on mute.
How about now?
Okay, that's
Can you
better.
hear me now?
I got you now. Go for it.
Okay, well, it's nice to hear from the other producers in other commodity fields. You already know my name, Taylor Haynes. I'm Vice President of OCM. I served 2 full terms on the board of RCAF USA. I founded Independent Cattlemen of Wyoming after a lifetime membership in Wyoming Stock Growers because of their affiliation with NCBA. I served in NCBA as up and coming future chairman of the Animal Welfare Committee, but as I raised issues about transparency with checkoff and country of origin labeling, they summarily showed me the door, which also showed me the light. And as I joined RCAF and formed Independent Cattlemen of Wyoming, I came to understand that the checkoff does not benefit ground level commodity producers and livestock for sure. I've been on both sides of the street in livestock. I've had a direct retail business, direct wholesale, and I've also sold through the commodity system. And all the checkoff does is take money out of your pocket if you sell live cattle, if you sell raw milk, and other raw commodity products. And so I am all in favor of transparency. And I'll be brief because I want other people to speak. But the one thing I want us to consider, and I agree with transparency, I agree with investigation, and I'm pleased about the legislation. But let's think about making the checkoff voluntary or ending the checkoff altogether and see who it benefits and who it hurts. I guarantee you, if we made it voluntary or if we got rid of it altogether, you would see the small family farm commodity producers flourish. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. God be with us all.
Thank you, Taylor. Next up, Mike Schultz, Board Director from Kansas.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for everybody being on the call today. The concern of the checkoff goes rather deep, and it's lasted a long time. I've been involved trying to expose the laundering of the cash. An example here in Kansas is the KL building with the same staff. The funding of the beef council, the beef money pays the rent on the building. It kind of bothers me. The thefts that we've seen, including Oklahoma, Wisconsin, with no oversight, those seem to be a problem. I guess, part of it is we've not done a very good job with the checkoff being involved to where we can get representation of the cattle industry. They've represented the beef industry quite well. They've capitalized a majority of the money has been going to them. And so I'd like to see that done. In view of the checkoff, and we talk about getting a vote, the FSA office, I believe USDA should have been in charge of that. Since we've not had a vote, I would like to see offering a solution that FSA get involved with that and help get that pushed through USDA. The shift of the money, I think the OFF Act addresses that, taking it away from the lobbying groups as NCBA. Things that we could offer solutions if we decide to keep that program would be possibly implementing mandatory country of origin labeling, use some of the funds to rebuild existing plants and processing stuff. The referendum on a 5-year vote so that people have a choice to shift where the money's being spent, I think are important. The other thing I think that's important is a general election rather than a based election off of membership of an organizational group. And if nothing else, to opt in rather than to opt out. So it is a producer's right to opt in. If you want to give money, make it voluntary. That's your choice. Those are just a few of my issues. I appreciate everybody for stepping forward, bringing this bill. It's very important that we try to get this passed and get some corrections. The laundering of the money, the last thing I'll leave you with, in 2016, the thing that got my goat up on this deal was they spent $9.6 million to NCBA to study whether people prefer eating beef. That's just a classic example of the laundering. That really frustrated me. It's a big deal. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mike. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mike, for that. And I've intentionally let Fred Stokes for last. Fred Stokes is the founder of OCM and has many thoughts on this issue. Fred, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mike. And we deeply appreciate Senator Lee and his co-sponsors for filing this bill. And all of us need to work very hard to support them and hope that we can get it through. I'm not a newcomer to this issue. I go back to the 70s when we discussed the possibility of a beef promotion program, which I thought was a wonderful idea. However, what we have today is something different than the thing that we had in mind at that time. The beef checkoff as a promotion program has been a dismal failure. Over the 36 years now that it has been mandatory as part of the Farm Bill in '85, there has been $3 billion or thereabouts expended. The results of that expenditure has been cutting the consumption of beef per capita essentially in half and doubling the consumption of competing meats such as pork. I mean, as chicken and pork. In addition, there have been some 40% of our producers have been forced out of business. The program has been rife with corruption. And in 2010, there was an independent audit conducted by Clifton Gunderson. They reviewed the transactions for 1% of those for 2 years and 5 months. If you want to do the numbers, that's about 9 days of transactions. They found errors, misappropriation, theft, whatever you want to call it, to the extent that initially 210,000 had to be repaid by NCBA, the prime contractor, to the beef fund. Later, they found other errors, and the total became something over 300,000 for 9 days. That's over $30,000 a day in misappropriation. There's a question: does anybody have a notion of how much they might have misappropriated during the entire 25 years that they've been essentially the exclusive contractor for the program. If you want to do the numbers and you assume during that period that they continued at the rate of about $30,000 a day, the number turns out to be over $275 million that if they were pilfering at that rate across the whole 25 years. It's regrettable that we have essentially wasted $3 billion of hard-earned money extracted from struggling cattle producers. It's regrettable that a lot of that has been involved in corruption. But to me, the big consequence, the most negative aspects of the checkoff program is that it has funded and installed NCBA as the voice of the industry.
Right.
When people on Capitol Hill want to talk about the cattle, they call NCBA. They represent, as members, less than 4% of the producers in this country. They carry a very big stick, and they've been on the wrong side of all the issues from the perspective of the producer. Senator Grassley from Iowa has called them Packer lackeys, and I think that's a pretty apt description of them. So we need to get this thing passed. We need to defund NCBA. The IG report reflected a number of 83% of their total revenue as being derived from the checkoff. And if we terminate the program, cut off that funding, that's their lifeline. I think they disappear as a significant force in opposition to our interest. They're a roadblock. It's going to be very difficult to bring about a transparent, open, and competitive market for beef cattle and indeed all of these commodities, so long as these organizations who have hijacked the funds and established themselves continue in operation.
Thank you, Fred. I appreciate that. We have a few other board members on as well. Are there any other comments that any other board member would like to make? Or if a member of the press has a question for anyone that had spoke here so far, now would be the chance. We have about 5 minutes left before we're finished with the Zoom conference. So is there any comments or questions?
Mike, I'd like to comment a little on a couple things that have been said here. The first one was what Marty said, that this is an unlikely group of sponsors for this bill. This shows the need for this legislation to correct this problem. It is not a partisan issue on this thing. It's nonpartisan, and we need this, to really work together on this issue because it's a real serious issue. The other thing Fred says, it's unfortunate that we've lost so many of this. It's unfortunate that this checkoff legislation will correct a problem that's not just the beef checkoff, it's all checkoffs. Mm-hmm. And these are checkoffs that were put in to support farmers and ranchers. And since 1996, we have lost over 400,000 of those people. That shows that our checkoffs have not been doing their job. Thank you.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Any questions from the press? Well, for those that are joining by way of press, I encourage you, if you haven't already, to look up the legislation that has been put forth by Senator Lee, just by simply typing in check off or off act or Senator Lee. I'm sure you'll be able to find it. And I'd just like to also say that if you would like to at any time reach out to any one of our board members, feel free to do so. If you don't have their contact information, I'd be happy to get that to you. And a special thanks too for each one of the participants that came on with National Dairy Producers Organization, NFO, and as well as Pennsylvania Farmers Union. Thank you so much for that. I think it shows that we're all in this together. and that there's multiple organizations that are pushing or pulling on the rope in the same direction as we are. And that's a huge step. And I hope that the press can see that. That was the reason why we wanted this conference call here today. We wanted to be able to be a resource to you if you have questions. I do believe that the board of OCM knows what we're talking about, and we have friends who know what they're talking about, who are involved in this as well. So anything last minute before we conclude from anyone?
Hey, Mike,
Yes.
This is Joaquin.
Yes, Joaquin.
Do I have a chance?
Yes, go for it. Joaquin is a dairy farmer from California.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and for this opportunity. I'm a dairyman here in California in the Central Valley, and we've lost within a 5-mile radius of my farm. We've lost 25 dairymen in the last 15 years here in my area. And I used to raise, and I still do raise feeder calves, Holstein feeder calves, which would be the bull calves from the dairy farm here. And I'm selling those calves today for almost the same price as I was selling them back in the late 60s, early 70s when I first started raising these. And beef cows today, anywhere between 40 to 60 cents is not much different than what the beef cow price was in the 70s and 80s. And just look around at other things where vehicles, real estate, doesn't matter what it is. Everything's gone up in 4, 5, 6 times whatever the price was back then. And yet we have almost the same price for something as essential as beef. And as one of the speakers earlier said, our consumption of beef has actually gone down in the United States. And look at the price of beef today in the stores where it's at. Something's wrong when you got beef prices at the level that they are today in the stores, and what the farmers getting basically the same price that they were getting 30 to 40 years ago. Something's really wrong.
That's right.
Thank you, Mike.
Mike, Fred Stokes.
Yeah, Fred, we
If
have a
I
minute
might
left.
just squeeze
Yep. 1
squeeze
minute.
in this Diana Moss, who is the president of the American Antitrust Institute, is working with us on some projects. She was quoted in an article by the Omaha World Press yesterday with a statement which is really profound. She says, between 1980 and 2020, the retail sector's percentage of the beef dollar has grown 65%. The packer share has increased even more by over 70%. At that same time, producer share fell by more than 40%.
Mm.
If that isn't a powerful message, I don't know what is.
I agree. Well, thank you, everyone. 30 seconds left. I'll just say once again, appreciate all the organizational support, and we support the senators for putting forth this piece of legislation. So with that, I'll sign off, say thank you, and look for more of these conferences in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.